I'm 41, and I built my career quietly, brick by brick, starting from the pavement up and earning my authority the hard way without any shortcuts. For years, I gave my time, my stability, and my protection to someone close to me, keeping the peace, smoothing over the rough edges, and letting my own role fade into the background. But when I was publicly dismissed and warned not to touch what wasn't meant for me, I made a decision that changed the entire trajectory of my life. Have you ever been underestimated or humiliated by someone you supported without question? If that sounds familiar, you aren't alone. Before I explain exactly what happened next, take a moment to think about your own boundaries. And if you've ever had to stand your ground after being disrespected, you'll understand why I did what I did. Because what happened next? No one saw it coming. I learned discipline before I learned multiplication. My father, Frank, believed in order the way some people believe in religion. Everything had a place. Everyone had a rank. And the people at the top, they were untouchable gods. Frank worked in municipal administration for 32 years, mid-level management at the Department of Public Works, decent pension, respectable enough. But he talked about power like he lived next door to it. VIPs, city executives, the people who mattered. He'd come home from work functions and recount every detail. Who shook whose hand, who got escorted where, who sat at which table. I absorbed it all without questioning. That was just how the world worked. I was 17 when I told him I wanted to join the force. He looked at me for a long time across the kitchen island, then nodded slowly. Good benefits, he said. Stable work. He didn't say he was proud. He said it was practical. I think that mattered more to him than anything else. The academy was harder than I expected and easier than I feared. I liked the structure. I liked knowing exactly what was expected of me. I liked that effort translated directly into results. No ambiguity, no favoritism, just standards you either met or you didn't. My father attended my graduation. He took photos but didn't show them to many people. When relatives asked, he'd say I was in law enforcement and immediately change the subject. I didn't mind at the time. I wasn't doing it for recognition. The first few years involved long hours and short paychecks. I worked Thanksgiving. I missed my mother's birthdays. I took assignments in D.C. that no one else wanted because they led somewhere. Frank appreciated the overtime pay I sent home. My mother appreciated that I called every Sunday. Neither of them asked much about the work itself. I made investigator at 26, senior investigator at 29. My father mentioned it to his golf buddies once, casually, like he'd predicted it all along. But when I came home for Christmas that year, he introduced me to his neighbor as, my daughter, the one who works for the government. No title, no specifics. Just vague enough to be respectful, vague enough to be dismissive. The promotions kept coming, not because I was lucky, but because I worked cases other people found too complicated or too boring. I built federal prosecutions that held up under scrutiny. I in court without faltering. I made myself indispensable before anyone thought to ask if I was capable. By 35, I was supervising entire divisions. By 38, I was briefing elected officials on Capitol Hill. By 40, I was making decisions that affected thousands of people. And my father still introduced me as if I worked a data entry desk job downtown. I never corrected him in public. It felt petty, unnecessary. He was my father. He'd raised me. He taught me about respect and hierarchy and knowing your place. I told myself he just didn't understand the scope of what I did. How could he? His world was budget meetings and parking assignments. But the money I sent home bought his new Ford. The connections I made got his friend's son out of a regulatory mess with the EPA. The credibility I built kept him relevant in circles he wouldn't have accessed otherwise. He never said thank you. He said, it's good to have someone in the family who knows people. I started noticing things, small things. How he'd stiffen when I corrected something he'd said about law enforcement procedures. How he'd steer conversations away from my work if it is anecdotes. How he'd use phrases like still learning and getting her feet wet when I'd been in the field longer than some of his colleagues had been alive. At his retirement party, someone asked him if he was proud. He laughed and said, she's always been ambitious. Got that from me, I think. Everyone smiled. I smiled too, but I felt something shift. ambition, as if wanting to be good at something was a personality flaw I'd inherited, not a choice I'd made. The donor event started when I moved into executive leadership, political fundraisers, charity galas, rooms full of people who wrote checks with more zeros than most people saw in a year. Frank loved these events. He'd request invitations through me, then spend the evening collecting business cards and introducing himself as father. I didn't mind bringing him. He enjoyed it, and honestly, it was easier to have him there than to explain why he was. But his behavior started changing. He'd hover near me in receiving lines, correcting my posture. He'd steer me away from certain people, whispering, "That's Senator's chief of staff, don't bother him," or "Don't touch that car, that's for the governor." I found it odd. I was the one who had arranged half the security protocols for these events. I knew which vehicles were armored and which weren't. I knew which doors led where. But he treated me like a child sneaking into a country club, one misstep away from being thrown out. One night at a museum fundraiser in D.C., I reached for a program on a table near the coat check. Frank grabbed my wrist. "Those are for donors," he hissed. I looked at him. "Dad, I'm on the host committee." He blinked, then he let go and said, "Right, of course, I just meant, you know how people are." I didn't know what he meant, but I let it go. The fear in his voice, though, that stayed with me. He wasn't worried about etiquette. He was worried about being embarrassed, about me doing something that reflected poorly on him, about me forgetting, even for a second, that we were guests in someone else's world. Except I wasn't a guest. Not anymore. I was the person who decided who got cleared to attend. I was the person they called when something went wrong. But my father couldn't see that, or wouldn't. To him, authority was something other people had. We were just close enough to observe it. I stopped correcting him. It felt exhausting. And maybe part of me wanted to believe he was protecting me, that his caution came from love, not insecurity. But the truth was harder than that. He didn't see me as powerful. He saw me as lucky. Lucky to be invited, lucky to be tolerated, lucky to be close to people who actually mattered. And I'd spent so long making myself small enough to fit his view of me that I'd forgotten it years ago. The imbalance was invisible until it was. I gave stability. I gave discretion. I gave silence when it mattered and intervention when it didn't. He took credit. He took proximity. He took my rank and wore it like a borrowed coat, just long enough to feel important, then hung it back up before anyone asked if it fit. I told myself it didn't matter. But every time he introduced me without my title, every time he pulled me away from something I had every right to touch, every time he whispered, "They'll arrest you," I felt smaller. Not because I believed him, but because he did. The shift happened gradually, then all at once. Frank started describing my career as if luck had played the leading role. "Right place, right time," he'd say, shrugging modestly when someone asked how I'd advanced so quickly, as if I'd stumbled into a director-level position by accident. At family gatherings, he'd introduce me in vague terms. "Works in federal law enforcement." Someone would ask what I did specifically, and he'd wave his hand. "Oh, you know, investigations, bureaucracy, the usual." He'd smile, and they'd nod, and the conversation would move on before anyone realized he hadn't actually answered the question. I didn't push back. It felt unnecessary, almost childish, to insist on my title at a cousin's birthday party or a neighborhood barbecue, but the omissions added up. After a while, I realized no one in his social circle knew what I actually did. They knew I worked for the government. They knew it was something serious. Beyond that, I was a blank space he'd chosen not to fill in. The comments about my age were worse. I was 41, I'd been in the field for over 2 decades, but he joked to his friends, "She's still figuring it all out. You know how kids are." And they'd laugh politely, even though I was older than some of their children. He framed me as perpetually junior, perpetually provisional, always one mistake away from being exposed as unqualified. I started noticing how he behaved in professional settings. We attended a law enforcement memorial service together, and he positioned himself 2 steps behind me in every photo, as if proximity to my rank might transfer some reflected importance. But when a deputy director greeted me by name and title, my father's face went tight. He smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. Later in the car, he said, "You don't need to make such a big deal about your job. People don't like show-offs." I hadn't said a word about my job. Someone else had. But in my father's mind, being acknowledged was the same as bragging. The real trouble started when his social world began to overlap with my professional one. He'd gotten involved with a PAC, Political Action Committee. Nothing major, just volunteer work that let him attend events with local officials and campaign donors. Suddenly, he was in rooms where my job actually mattered, where people knew who I was, and he hated it. Not overtly. He never said, "I don't want you here." But his body language screamed discomfort. He'd steer me toward the edges of rooms. He'd position himself between me and anyone he deemed important, as if my presence might somehow contaminate his networking opportunities. He started policing my behavior, where I stood, what I touched, who I spoke to. At a donor luncheon, I reached for a seat near the front. Frank caught my elbow. "Those are reserved," he whispered urgently. I showed him my name card on the table. He stared at it like it was written in a foreign language, then muttered something about making sure it wasn't a mistake. It wasn't a mistake. I was supposed to be there, but he couldn't process that. In his mind, people like us didn't sit at the front. We didn't get name cards. We hovered in the back, grateful to be included. The security theater was the strangest part. At every event, Frank became obsessed with boundaries, velvet ropes, restricted areas, VIP sections. He'd pull me away from doors, from vehicles, from anywhere that seemed remotely exclusive. "Don't touch that," he'd hiss. "That's not for us." Once at a state capitol event, I walked toward a secured entrance where I needed to check in with the advance team. My father grabbed my arm hard enough to leave a mark. "You can't go in there," he said, his voice sharp with panic. "That's for officials only. They'll arrest you." I looked at him, really looked at him. His face was pale. His hand was shaking slightly. He wasn't joking. He genuinely believed that I, a federal director with clearance levels he couldn't begin to understand, would be arrested for walking through a door. I gently removed his hand from my arm. "Dad, I'm cleared for this area." He shook his head. "You don't understand how these things work." I didn't argue. I just walked through the entrance. The security officer nodded at me. My father stood outside staring as if the world had just rearranged itself in a way he couldn't comprehend. After that, I started watching him more carefully. He spoke about power constantly, but never from it. He name-dropped officials he'd never spoken to. He described security protocols he'd never actually seen. He constructed an entire framework of who mattered and who didn't. And he placed himself just close enough to matter by association, but never close enough to be responsible. And I realized something uncomfortable. My father had built his identity around proximity to authority. He didn't have power himself, so he borrowed it from his job title, from his volunteer work, from me. But as my authority grew, his comfort shrank. I was supposed to stay in a supporting role. I was supposed to be impressive enough to reflect well on him, but not so impressive that I overshadowed him. I was supposed to be his credential, not my own person. The tension built quietly, the way pressure builds in a locked room. Nothing exploded. Nothing shattered, but the air got thinner, and I knew eventually something would have to give. The event was routine, a high-profile security conference in Northern Virginia with federal, state, and local officials. Dignified handshakes, coordinated logistics, the kind of thing I'd overseen 100 times. Frank had asked to attend weeks earlier, citing his PAC connections. I'd cleared him without hesitation. The venue was a historic hotel with tight security perimeters, motorcades, restricted zones, the kind of setup that required advanced coordination and multiple clearance levels. I'd been briefed twice. My father had been briefed never. He was there as a guest, not a participant. We arrived separately. I came early for a coordination meeting. He arrived with the general attendee group. I was finishing with the lead agent when I saw him near the main entrance, looking slightly lost. I waved. He saw me, and his posture straightened like he just remembered he belonged there. The arrival started around 1800 hours. Armored vehicles, motorcycle escorts, the usual choreography of power. My father stood near the valet area, watching everything with the intensity of someone trying to memorize details for later retelling. I was reviewing a security manifest when I heard his voice, sharp and loud. Step back. I looked up. He was walking toward me quickly, his face flushed. Behind him, a black armored limousine was pulling up to the secured entrance, the kind of vehicle that costs $250,000 and can survive an RPG strike. Don't touch that, he said, louder now, grabbing my arm and pulling me backward. That's for VIPs, you'll get arrested. I blinked. Dad, I'm serious, you can't be near that, they will arrest you. His voice carried. People turned. A few security personnel glanced over, trying to assess if there was an actual problem. My father's hand tightened on my arm, his eyes wide with a kind of frantic certainty. He genuinely believed I was about to commit some unforgivable breach of protocol. I looked at the limousine, then at my father, then at the growing circle of attention around us. I reached into my jacket pocket. Not quickly, not dramatically, just calmly. I pulled out the keyless remote access device I'd been issued that morning, the one that controlled access to all executive vehicles in the secure convoy. I pressed the unlock button. The limousine's lights flashed once. The armored doors clicked open with a heavy pneumatic sound that echoed in the quiet. My father froze. His hand dropped from my arm. A senior security official stepped forward from the vehicle's shadow. Deputy Chief David, Federal Protective Service, someone I'd worked with on 3 previous events. He nodded at me, his voice calm and professional. Good morning, Director. The words hung in the air. Director. My father's face went through several expressions in rapid succession. Confusion, realization, something that looked like he'd been physically struck. He took a step back, his mouth opening slightly, then closing. No sound came out. I held his gaze for a moment. Then I turned to, everything set for the arrival. Yes, ma'am, perimeters locked down, we're clear to proceed. Good, I'll be inside in 5. Nodded and moved off to coordinate with his team. The limousine's doors remained open, waiting around us. The small crowd that had formed began to disperse, conversation resuming in low murmurs. My father stood completely still. His hands hung at his sides. He looked at me like I was a stranger. Not with pride, not with admiration, but with something closer to betrayal, as if I'd lied to him by not insisting he understands something he'd refused to see. Dad, I said quietly. He shook his head slightly, a barely perceptible movement. Then he turned and walked away, not toward the main entrance, but toward the parking area, his shoulders rigid. I didn't follow him. Security protocols don't stop because your father is humiliated. The conference continued. I did my job, but the image of his face, frozen, pale, stricken, stayed with me through every briefing and every handshake. He didn't try to find me afterward. He left the event early. I got a single text message around 2100 hours, got a ride home, talk later. We didn't talk later, not that night, not the next day. Silence did the work that words couldn't. The humiliation wasn't mine. It was entirely, unmistakably his. And it had happened in public, in front of people whose opinions he valued, in a context where his authority meant nothing and mine meant everything. I'd unlocked a door, that was all. But in doing so, I'd unlocked something else. A truth he'd spent years trying to keep locked away, that I wasn't the person he'd decided I was, that I hadn't stayed in the role he'd assigned me. That somewhere along the way, while he was still explaining how the world worked, I'd quietly become part of the machinery he thought he understood. The worst part wasn't his reaction. It was realizing that he'd never actually asked me what I did. He'd assumed. He guessed. He'd filled in blanks with his own limitations. And when reality didn't match his assumptions, he tried to pull me back into the version of me that made sense to him. But that version didn't exist anymore. Maybe it never had. The protocol after a high-security event is efficient and impersonal. You're escorted where you need to be. Conversations happen in controlled environments. Everything is documented. I was pulled into a post-arrival briefing almost immediately after the limousine incident. Deputy Chief was professional as always. If he'd noticed the tension between my father and me, he didn't mention it. We reviewed entry logs, confirmed clearances, checked timelines. Standard procedure. My father wasn't part of it. He had left before the briefings even started. I didn't see him again that night. When I finally got back to my hotel room around 2300 hours, I had 2 missed calls from my mother and a voicemail that just said, "Call me when you can." I didn't call. I knew what the conversation would be. Frank had called her upset, probably framing the entire incident as a misunderstanding or an overreaction by security. I wasn't ready to manage his feelings. Not yet. I slept poorly. Not because I regretted what happened, I didn't, but because I kept replaying the look on his face. That moment of complete cognitive dissonance, like the world had reorganized itself without his permission. The next day, I drove back home. My father's car was in the driveway when I arrived. I'd expected him to avoid me, maybe stay at a friend's place for a few days, but he was there, sitting in the kitchen with a cup of coffee that had gone cold. He looked up when I walked in, didn't say anything, just looked. I set my bag down. "We should talk." He nodded slowly, then he said, "I didn't know." "I know, you never asked." "I did, multiple times." He shook his head. "Not like that, you never made it clear." I pulled out a chair and sat across from him. "Dad, I've been a director for 3 years. I brief congressional committees. I manage operations across 6 states. I've told you this." "You said you got promoted." "I've gotten promoted 8 times. He looked away. "It's not the same." "What's not the same?" "Saying you got promoted and that, yesterday, whatever that was." I understood what he meant. Hearing about authority was abstract, seeing it exercised was concrete, and he couldn't reconcile the two. "Why didn't you tell them?" he asked. "The security people, why didn't you tell them you were just a guest?" I stared at him, because I wasn't just a guest, that was my event, I coordinated it. His face flushed. "You let me embarrass myself." "You embarrassed yourself. I unlocked a car I was assigned to unlock. You knew I didn't understand. I've been trying to make you understand for years." The silence that followed was heavy. He stared at his coffee mug. I watched him try to rewrite the event in his head, searching for an angle where he was reasonable and I was at fault. Finally, he said, "You should have warned me." "Warned you about what? That you'd become important," I finished. He flinched. "That's not what I meant." "Then what did you mean?" He didn't answer. I'd had this conversation before, in different forms with different people. Officers who couldn't accept being outranked by someone younger. Colleagues who assumed my promotions were political favors. Family members who thought my job was clerical work with a badge. I'd spent years explaining, justifying, proving. I was done. "Dad, I didn't hide anything from you. You just didn't want to see it." "That's not fair." "What's not fair is you treating me like a child at a professional event, because you couldn't process that I'm not a guest in those spaces. I belong there more than you do." His jaw tightened. The truth landed like a slap. Later that afternoon, I spoke with Sarah, my deputy director and the closest thing I had to a mentor. We worked together for nearly a decade. She'd seen me navigate toxic supervisors, institutional bias, and the kind of bureaucratic warfare that broke less stubborn people. I told her about the incident. She listened without interrupting. When I finished, she said, "This wasn't about the limo." "I know. He's been carrying a version of you in his head that doesn't exist. And yesterday, that version shattered." "So what do I do?" "Nothing, you let him sit with it. He needs to reconcile who he thought you were with who you actually are. That's his work, not yours, and if he can't," she shrugged, "then you move forward anyway. You've been doing that your whole career." It was true. I'd learned early that waiting for permission meant staying still. I'd stopped waiting years ago. That night, my father tried again. He said he was proud of me, but the words felt rehearsed, obligatory. He didn't ask about my work. He didn't ask how I'd gotten to where I was. He just said he wished things had gone differently. I realized he wasn't apologizing for disrespecting me. He was apologizing for being embarrassed. There's a difference. I told him I needed space, that I'd be limiting contact for a while, not as punishment, but as necessity. I couldn't keep shrinking myself to fit his understanding. It was exhausting, and it wasn't fair to either of us. He looked hurt, then angry, then resigned. "You're choosing your job over your family," he said. "No," I replied. "I'm choosing not to apologize for my job to my family." He left the next morning. No dramatic exit, no shouting, just a quiet, strained goodbye. And for the first time in years, I felt like I could breathe. The first few weeks after the limo incident, I expected my father to push back harder, to call, to show up unannounced, to force a reconciliation on his terms. But he didn't. He went quiet in a way that felt deliberate, not quite the silent treatment. He'd respond to logistical texts, confirm he'd received the documents I sent for a family estate matter, but the conversations were transactional, distant. I didn't chase him. I'd spent too many years managing his expectations, smoothing over his discomfort, translating my career into terms he could digest. I was done. My mother called once, tentatively, asking if I'd had a chance to talk to my father. I told her we talked. She asked if we'd worked things out. I said we'd established boundaries. She went quiet, then said she'd pray for us both. I thanked her and changed the subject. My father tried a different approach through my uncle, his younger brother, someone he'd always seen as more reasonable than him. My uncle called on a Sunday afternoon, casual and friendly, before easing into the real reason. "Your dad's pretty torn up about what happened." "I know," I said. "He feels like him. He himself. Come on, you know how he is. He just didn't realize." "Exactly, he didn't realize because he never asked." My uncle sighed. "He's your father, you can't just cut him off." "I haven't cut him off. I've set expectations. If he wants to be part of my life, he needs to respect what I do and who I am. That's not unreasonable." "He does respect you." "No, he respects the idea of me that makes him comfortable. That's different." The conversation ended politely, but inconclusively. I knew my uncle would report back, probably framing me as stubborn or unforgiving. I didn't care. I wasn't interested in being the easy daughter anymore. Extended family weighed in sporadically over the next month. A cousin suggested I was being too sensitive. An aunt reminded me that family comes first. A second cousin I barely knew sent a long message about forgiveness and grace that read like it had been drafted by Frank himself. I responded to none of them. The pressure felt coordinated, like my father had activated every relational lever he could find. Hopping one of them would move me. But I'd been in leadership long enough to recognize a pressure campaign. And I'd been in law enforcement long enough to know that capitulating to pressure only invites more of it. Meanwhile, my work continued. A high-profile task force investigation, budget hearings, a recruitment initiative I'd been developing for 2 years finally got funding approval. My life didn't stop because my father was uncomfortable. I did notice something, though. Without my father as a buffer, my professional identity felt sharper, clearer. I stopped second-guessing how I presented myself in meetings. I stopped downplaying accomplishments when I briefed senior officials. I stopped apologizing for taking up space. One afternoon during a joint agency meeting, a deputy assistant director I'd worked with before pulled me aside. "You seem different," he said. "More confident." I almost laughed. "I'm the same." "No," he said thoughtfully. "You're not. Something shifted." He was right. Something had shifted. I'd stopped performing a version of myself that made other people comfortable. I'd stopped translating my authority into softer terms. I'd stopped shrinking. The consequence for my father was simple. He lost proximity. The invitations to donor events stopped. The easy access to VIP spaces disappeared. The second-hand credibility he borrowed from my career evaporated. I heard through my mother that he'd tried to attend a political fundraiser he'd gone to the year before. His name wasn't on the list. He'd mentioned that his daughter worked in federal law enforcement. The organizer politely said they'd look into it. They never called back. He wasn't blacklisted. He just wasn't prioritized. Without me clearing him, vouching for him, or bringing him as a guest, he was just another mid-level retiree with a volunteer position. Unremarkable, forgettable. The loss wasn't dramatic. It was erosive, slow, quiet, the kind of irrelevance that creeps in when you realize the access you had was never really yours. I didn't take satisfaction in it, but I didn't feel guilty either. Around week 6, Frank sent a long email. It started with an apology, sort of. He said he was sorry for the misunderstanding and admitted he could have handled things better, but then it pivoted. He talked about how hard it had been for him watching me grow distant, how he'd always supported my career, how he didn't deserve to be punished for not understanding every detail of my job. The email ended with, "I'm still your father, that should count for something." I read it twice, then I closed my laptop. Sarah asked me about it a few days later over coffee. "You going to respond?" I don't know. Part of me wants to. Part of me thinks responding just opens the door to more negotiations. What would you tell one of your junior officers if they were dealing with this? I thought about that. I'd tell them that apologies without changed behavior aren't apologies. They're just requests to reset the dynamic without addressing what broke it. So I'm not responding, not yet. She nodded, good. My father's social world shifted in ways I only heard about secondhand. He built an identity around proximity to power, around knowing people, around being invited. Without that, he was adrift. He tried joining a different volunteer organization. It didn't have the same prestige. He tried reconnecting with old colleagues. Most had moved on. I didn't intervene. I didn't smooth things over. I let him experience the full weight of what it meant to rely on someone else's credibility instead of building your own. For the first time in my adult life, I felt no obligation to make him comfortable. No responsibility to manage his feelings, no compulsion to be smaller so he could feel bigger. And I realized that's what I'd been doing for years. Not just with him, with everyone who couldn't process that I'd their understanding of me. The boundary I set wasn't cruel. It was necessary. And I wasn't apologizing for it. 3 months after the limo incident, I got promoted. Not a lateral move, not a title adjustment, a full advancement. Executive-level authority, expanded jurisdiction, higher clearance. The kind of promotion that came with a formal ceremony, official notifications, and a pay grade most people spent entire careers trying to reach. My mother called to congratulate me. She sounded proud but tentative, like she wasn't sure if bringing it up might reopen old wounds. I thanked her. We talked about logistics, the ceremony date, whether I'd have guests if I needed help with anything. She didn't mention my father, neither did I. 2 days before the ceremony, my father sent a text. Heard about the promotion. Congratulations, that was it. No follow-up, no request to attend, just acknowledgement, thin and carefully neutral. I didn't invite him. The ceremony itself was understated. Federal events usually are. Speeches were short. Handshakes were firm. Officials I'd worked with for years offered congratulations that felt genuine. Sarah stood beside me during the formal swearing-in, her presence steady and grounding. Afterward, at the small reception, a senior official I'd briefed maybe twice pulled me aside. "You've earned this," he said. "Don't let anyone convince you otherwise." I nodded, "Thank you." I mean it. Some people get here because of who they know. You got here because of what you've done. That's rarer than you think. I believed him, not because I needed validation, but because I'd finally stopped questioning whether I deserved the positions I'd earned. The doubt I'd carried for years, the quiet suspicion that maybe my father was right, maybe I'd just been lucky, maybe I'd been overestimated, was gone. Life without my father's interference was quieter, simpler. I stopped bracing for his commentary at professional events because he was at them anymore. I stopped translating my work into terms he'd accept because I no longer cared if he accepted them. I stopped performing a version of myself that fit his understanding. The work itself became easier. Not the tasks, those were as demanding as ever, but the emotional labor around them. I wasn't carrying the weight of someone else's insecurity. I wasn't managing two identities, the one I actually inhabited, and the one my father needed me to inhabit so he could feel relevant. I moved through secure spaces without self-consciousness. I used my title without hesitation. I made decisions without wondering how they'd be perceived by someone who never understood what I did in the first place. One evening about 4 months after the incident, I attended a law enforcement memorial service. High-ranking officials, somber tone, the kind of event my father would have loved to attend, not because he cared about the memorial but because of who would be there. I saw him across the plaza. He was there with his volunteer group, standing near the back, holding a program. He saw me too. Our eyes met briefly. He nodded. I nodded back. Neither of us approached. Later, I heard from my mother that he'd mentioned seeing me. "He said you looked good," she said carefully. "Professional." Professional? The word felt loaded, as if he'd finally categorized me in a way that made sense to him. Not his daughter who'd gotten lucky, not the girl who'd worked for the government, but someone professional. Someone whose authority was undeniable, even from a distance. I didn't need his acknowledgement, but part of me noted it anyway. He was learning, slowly, that I didn't exist in the margins of other people's power. I existed at the center of my own. Around month 5, my mother asked if I'd consider having dinner with my father. Not to reconcile, she clarified. Just to talk. "He's been different," she added. "Quieter." "Different how?" "He doesn't talk about your job anymore. Not to his friends. Not to me. It's like he's afraid to bring it up." "Good," I said. "I'm not being cruel, Mom. I'm just done pretending. If he wants to be part of my life, he knows what's required." She sighed. "What's required?" "Respect, actual respect. Not the conditional kind where he's proud of me as long as I don't outshine him. Real respect. Where he sees me as I am, not as he needs me to be." "That's asking a lot." "It's asking the bare minimum." She didn't push further. The shift wasn't external, it was internal. I'd given myself permission to stop accommodating his limitations. I'd stopped bending to fit a framework that was too small for who I'd become. I used to think that authority had to be loud, announced, defended, but real authority is quiet. It doesn't need to justify itself. It doesn't need to perform, it just is. My father had spent his whole life believing power was something other people had. Something you observed from a distance, admired from the outside, borrowed when you could. He never held it himself, so he didn't recognize it when I did. But that was his failure, not mine. I thought about the limo incident sometimes. Not with regret, not with anger, just as a point of clarity. A moment when the truth became undeniable, even to someone who'd spent years avoiding it. I'd unlocked a door because it was mine to unlock. Not to prove anything, not to humiliate anyone, just because it was my job. And somewhere in that simple act, I'd unlocked something else. The version of myself that didn't need permission. The version that didn't shrink. The version that had been there all along, waiting for me to stop apologizing for her. I didn't need my father to see it, but I needed me to see it. And finally, I did. 6 months after the limo incident, my father reached out. Not through family intermediaries, not through vague, obligatory texts, a direct call late on a Tuesday evening. I almost didn't answer, but something about the timing, late enough to be deliberate, early enough to avoid being intrusive, made me pick up. His voice sounded different, tired, careful. "Hi, Dad." Silence, not the hostile kind, the uncertain kind. "I've been thinking," he said finally, "about what happened, about everything." I waited. "I owe you an apology, a real one." I leaned back in my chair. "Okay." "Not for the limo. I mean, yes, for that too, but for all of it, for not seeing you, for not asking, for making you feel like you had to be smaller so I could be, I don't know, relevant." The word surprised me. Not because it was eloquent, it wasn't, but because it was honest. I've been thinking about why I did that, he continued. And I think I was scared. Scared of what? Of not mattering, of being left behind. You kept growing and I stayed the same, and instead of being proud, I just felt small. I didn't respond immediately. Part of me wanted to soften the moment to reassure him, but another part, stronger, more certain, knew that softening it would undo the work the past 6 months had required. Dad, I needed you to see me, not the version of me you were comfortable with, the actual me. I know, I see that now. Do you? I'm trying to. It wasn't a full apology. It wasn't a complete reckoning, but it was more than he'd ever offered before. We talked for another 20 minutes carefully, both of us navigating new terrain. He asked about my work. Real questions this time, not vague generalities. I answered honestly without translating or minimizing. He listened without interrupting. Before we hung up, he said, I'd like to see you. If that's something you'd be open to, he added. Maybe, eventually. But I need to know that when we're together, you're not going to treat me like a liability. I won't, I mean it, Dad. No pulling me away from doors. No whispering about who I can and can't talk to. No managing me in public. I understand. Do you? He paused, then quietly, I'm learning. A month later, we met for coffee, neutral territory, a cafe halfway between his place and mine. He arrived early looking nervous. I arrived exactly on time. The conversation was stilted at first, small talk, whether family updates. But eventually he asked, do you like what you do? The question caught me off guard. What your job, do you like it? I thought about it. Most days, yes, it's hard but it matters. That's good, he nodded slowly. I should have asked that years ago. Yeah, you should have. We didn't fix everything in that one conversation. We didn't erase decades of misunderstanding, but something shifted. He stopped trying to explain me to himself and started just listening. Over the next few months, we built something new, not the relationship we had before that was gone and neither of us wanted it back, but something functional, adult, based on mutual respect, not obligation. He stopped introducing me vaguely. When people asked what I did, he said, she's a federal director, law enforcement. No minimizing, no vague deflections, just the truth. The first time I heard him do it at a family gathering, I almost didn't believe it, but he said it plainly, without discomfort, and when someone asked follow-up questions, he gestured to me. You should ask her, she knows more about it than I do. It was a small thing, but it mattered. Trust rebuilt slowly. He didn't ask to attend my professional events anymore. He didn't request invitations or clearances. He stayed in his lane, and when I occasionally brought him to something, a low-security ceremony, a public recognition event, he was respectful, appropriate. He didn't hover. He didn't police my behavior, he just was. One evening after a promotion ceremony for one of my deputies, he pulled me aside. You're good at this, he said. Really good. I don't think I ever told you that. No, you didn't. I should have. I nodded, yeah, you should have. He looked uncomfortable, but he didn't deflect. He just said, I'm telling you now. It wasn't a perfect reconciliation. There were still moments of tension, still conversations that hit old wounds, but the foundation had changed. He wasn't trying to manage me anymore. He wasn't trying to make me fit a version of myself that made him comfortable. He was just trying to see me, the real me, and that, finally, was enough. The trust we rebuilt wasn't emotional. It was functional. We didn't have long heart-to-hearts or therapy-style processing sessions. We just operated with new rules. He respected my authority. I allowed him proximity. He stayed within boundaries. I didn't punish him for past mistakes. It wasn't warm, but it was real. And for the first time in years, I didn't feel like I was carrying him. I wasn't translating my life into terms he could handle. I wasn't performing a role to keep peace. I was just myself, and he was learning to be okay with that. A year after the limo incident, I attended a Senate briefing. High stakes, high visibility, the kind of event that required precision, composure, and the ability to answer hostile questions without flinching. I'd prepared for weeks. My team had reviewed every possible angle. We'd anticipated pushback, rehearsed responses, and mapped out contingencies. I walked into the hearing room calm and ready. My father wasn't there. He didn't ask to be. He didn't even know about it until afterward. The briefing went well. I answered questions clearly, defended our decisions firmly, and left no room for senators who'd been skeptical nodded. Aides took notes. Afterward, a senior appropriations chair approached me and said, "That was impressive, we'll be in touch." I left the building feeling lighter than I had in months. Not because of the praise, but because I'd done the work without second-guessing myself, without wondering if I was good enough, without carrying someone else's doubt. Later that evening, Sarah called. Heard the briefing was solid. It was. You sound surprised. I'm not, I'm realizing how much easier everything is without the noise. The noise. The doubt, the need to prove myself to people who are never going to see me clearly. Anyway. She laughed, "You're learning." I'm trying. No, she said, "You're doing it, there's a difference." The weeks that followed felt different, not because my responsibilities changed, they didn't, but because I moved through them with a clarity I hadn't had before. I stopped checking how others perceived me. I stopped translating my authority into softer language. I stopped apologizing for taking up space. At a multi-agency meeting, a senior official asked for my assessment on a jurisdictional question. I gave it directly, without hedging or deferring. Another official disagreed. I held my ground. The conversation continued, but my position stood. Afterward, the first official approached me. You've changed. How so? You're not asking for permission anymore. I smiled. I never needed it. I know, but now you know. The difference was subtle but profound. I'd spent years waiting for external validation, waiting for someone to confirm that I was competent, qualified, worthy. But external validation is conditional, it shifts. It's granted and withdrawn based on other people's comfort. Internal validation is permanent. It doesn't need reinforcement. It doesn't need approval. And once I stopped waiting for it from others, I found it in myself. My father and I settled into a routine. Monthly dinners, brief phone calls, updates on family matters. The relationship wasn't deep, but it was stable. He'd learned to respect boundaries. I'd learned to stop expecting him to be someone he was. One evening over dinner, he asked about a case I'd mentioned in passing. Not to challenge me, not to minimize it, just genuine curiosity. I explained the basics: jurisdiction issues, resource allocation, interagency coordination. He listened, asked clarifying questions, and at the end said, "That sounds complicated." It is. You handle it well. I looked at him, "Thank you." I mean it, he paused. I know I didn't always see that, but I do now. It wasn't a grand moment. No tears, no emotional breakthrough, just acknowledgement, simple and direct. But it mattered because for years I needed him to see me. And now that he finally did, I realized something unexpected. I didn't need it anymore. I'd already moved on. I'd already built an identity that didn't require his approval. His recognition was nice, but it wasn't necessary. The shift had happened internally long before he'd caught up. I thought about the limo incident sometimes. Not with anger, not with satisfaction, just with clarity. I'd unlocked a door because it was mine to unlock. Not to prove anything, not to humiliate anyone, just because it was my job. But in that moment, I'd also unlocked something else. The realization that I didn't need to wait for permission to be who I was. That I didn't need to translate my authority into terms someone else could accept. That I didn't need to carry other people's doubt. I already had the clearance. I already had the authority. I already had the right. I just needed to stop apologizing for it. The real change wasn't loud. It was quiet, cumulative, a series of small decisions that added up to something larger. I slept better, 8 hours most nights. No waking up at 300 hours replaying conversations or justifying decisions. My mind stayed still. I stopped over-explaining. In meetings, I stated my position clearly and stopped there. No softening language, no hedging. If someone needed clarification, they asked. If they disagreed, they said so. But I stopped preemptively managing their reactions. Boundaries felt natural instead of defensive. I said no to events that didn't serve a purpose. I limited contact with people who required me to be smaller. I protected my time without guilt. My relationships improved, not because I became warmer or more available, but because I stopped performing versions of myself that other people preferred. The people who stayed were the ones who liked me as I actually was. The ones who left were the ones who needed me to be someone else. Sarah noticed. "You seem settled," she said during a working lunch, "like you've stopped fighting something." "I have." "What changed?" "I stopped waiting for people to see me correctly. I just started being correct and letting them catch up." She smiled. "That's the whole job." "I know, it just took me a while to believe it." Work became easier, not less demanding but less exhausting. I stopped carrying the emotional weight of other people's perceptions. If someone underestimated me, that was their problem. If someone felt uncomfortable with my authority, that wasn't mine to fix. I led with clarity instead of accommodation. I made decisions based on what was right, not what was easiest. And I stopped apologizing when those decisions made people uncomfortable. My father and I reached a stable equilibrium. We weren't close, but we weren't hostile. He attended family events and behaved appropriately. He stopped offering unsolicited advice. He stopped treating me like a liability. At a cousin's wedding, someone asked him what I did for a living. He said, "She's a federal director, law enforcement, very high level." Then he changed the subject, not out of discomfort, but because he'd answered the question. It was a small thing, but it represented progress. My mother noticed the shift too. "You and your father seem better," she said during a visit. "We're functional." "That's better than you were." "It is." "Are you happy with that?" I thought about it. "Yeah, I don't need more than functional. He's not a close confidant. He's my father. We have a relationship that works. That's enough." She nodded, looking relieved. I think she'd worried we'd never speak again. But I never wanted that. I just needed him to stop trying to shrink me. One afternoon, I was walking through a federal building, heading to a classified briefing. I passed a group of junior agents in the hallway. One of them noticed my insignia and straightened instinctively. The others followed. I nodded at them. They nodded back. The exchange lasted 3 seconds, but I felt it. Not the deference, that was protocol, but the ease. I didn't second-guess whether I belonged there. I didn't wonder if they saw me as qualified. I just moved through the space like it was mine, because it was. 15 years is a long time in federal law enforcement. Administrations change, priorities shift. The faces in briefing rooms turn over, but the work remains steady, demanding, essential. I'm 56 now. My hair is more gray than brown. I wear reading glasses for late-night reports. My knees complain after long days on my feet, but my mind is sharper than it's ever been. Experience does that. It strips away the unnecessary and leaves only what matters. I'm no longer director. I'm assistant deputy secretary now. The promotion came 3 years ago after a career spent building cases, managing crises, and making decisions that held up under congressional scrutiny. The title is longer, the office is bigger, the responsibility is heavier, but the core work remains the same. Protecting people, upholding standards, leading with integrity. My father is 83. He lives in an assisted living facility now, not because he needs constant care, but because my mother passed 4 years ago and he couldn't manage the house alone. The facility is nice, clean, well-staffed. I visit once a month, sometimes twice if my schedule allows. Our relationship is cordial, distant, functional. He asks about my work in vague terms. I answer in vague terms. We talk about his health, the weather, family updates. We don't dig deeper. We don't need to. The limo incident feels like ancient history now. A moment from another lifetime, but its effects linger the way fault lines remain long after an earthquake. I think about it sometimes, usually when I'm mentoring younger officers. I see them struggling with the same things I struggled with. Imposter syndrome, the need for external validation, the instinct to make themselves smaller to avoid conflict. I see them hesitating before asserting authority they've already earned. Last month, I met with a 32-year-old special agent named Rachel Owens. Brilliant investigator, flawless record, recently promoted to supervisory level. She came to my office looking uncomfortable. "I need advice," she said, "about my father. He keeps introducing me as his daughter who works for the government. Not my title, not my role, just vaguely, and when I correct him, he gets defensive." I set down my pen. "Does he understand what you do?" "I've explained it multiple times, but I don't think he really gets it, or maybe he doesn't want to." "What do you think is happening?" She hesitated. "I think he's uncomfortable with me outranking him. Socially, I mean, he's a contractor, good job, stable income, but not this." She gestured at the office around us. I nodded slowly. "What do you want to happen?" "I want him to be proud of me, but I also want him to see me." "Actually see you. Those might be two different things." "I know," she looked down. "How did you handle it with your family?" I thought about how to answer. I set boundaries. I stopped managing other people's comfort with my authority, and I accepted that some people weren't going to see me the way I needed them to. And did it work? Eventually, but not the way I expected. "What do you mean?" I thought if I set boundaries, people would respect them and everything would be fine. But what actually happened is I stopped needing their respect. I found it in myself. She absorbed that quietly. "Your father's discomfort is his to manage," I continued. "You can explain your role clearly, you can set expectations, but you can't make him comfortable with something he's decided to be uncomfortable with. That's his work, not yours. So I just accept it." "No, you stop waiting for his acceptance. You do your job, you lead well, you build a career that matters, and if he catches up, great. If he doesn't, you keep moving forward anyway." She left looking thoughtful. I don't know if the advice helped, but I meant every word. The truth is, I spent years waiting for my father to see me clearly, and when he finally started to, I realized I didn't need it anymore. I'd built an identity independent of his perception. His approval became a nice-to-have instead of a necessity. That shift, from needing external validation to generating internal validation, was the most important professional development of my career. It changed how I led, how I made decisions, how I showed up in rooms full of people who outranked me or underestimated me or simply didn't know what to make of me. I stopped performing. I stopped translating. I stopped shrinking, and my career accelerated because of it. Last year, I before Congress about a controversial enforcement policy. The hearing was contentious. Senators interrupted. Accusations flew. The room was hostile. I sat calmly and answered every question directly. When a senator tried to my testimony, I corrected him firmly but respectfully. When another senator questioned my qualifications, I listed them without emotion. When a third senator tried to bait me into a political argument, I declined and redirected to the facts. Afterward, my chief of staff said, "You were unshakable in there." I've had practice. Still, most people would have gotten defensive. Defensive is what they want. It makes you look weak. I just told the truth and let them decide what to do with it. That approach, calm, direct, unbothered, came from years of learning that my authority didn't require defense. It just required consistency. I think about the officers I've trained over the years, the ones who succeeded and the ones who didn't. The difference was rarely competence. It was almost always confidence, not arrogance, not bravado, just the quiet certainty that they belonged in the rooms they occupied. The ones who waited for permission stalled. The ones who took initiative advanced. I learned that lesson the hard way, but I learned it. My father's decline has been gradual, not dramatic. Just the slow erosion of a man who built his identity around proximity to relevance and then lost that proximity. He's not bitter, he's just smaller, quieter, less certain. When I visit, he sometimes asks about my work. Real questions now, not performative ones. What does an assistant deputy secretary actually do? Or do you still work in the field? I answer honestly. He listens. Sometimes he asks follow-ups. Sometimes he just nods. Last month during a visit, he said, "I'm proud of you. I know I didn't always show it, but I am." I looked at him. 83 years old, gray and frail, still my father, but not the man I'd fought with 15 years ago. "I know," I said. "I should have said it more." "Yeah, you should have." He nodded slowly. "I was intimidated by you for a long time. I didn't know how to be your father when you became more successful than I ever was." It was the most honest thing he'd ever said to me. "You didn't need to be intimidated," I said. "You just needed to see me." "I see you now." "I know." We sat quietly for a while. Then he asked about my mother's grave. Had I visited recently? Did it need flowers? Should he call the groundskeeper? We talked logistics, safe territory. The moment passed, but it mattered because 15 years ago I needed that acknowledgement desperately. I needed him to see me, to respect me, to recognize what I'd built. And when he couldn't, it nearly broke our relationship. Now, when he finally offered it, I received it with gratitude but not need. I didn't require his validation anymore. I'd built something stronger than external approval. I'd built internal certainty. Last week, I gave a keynote address at a law enforcement leadership conference. 2,000 attendees, agents, officers, deputies from every federal agency and half the state agencies in the country. I spoke about leadership, integrity, and the importance of trusting your own judgment even when others don't understand your decisions. I told a version of the Limo story, not in detail, just the core of it. A moment when someone I loved couldn't see my authority, and how that moment forced me to decide. Would I shrink to fit their perception, or would I trust what I knew to be true? I told them I chose truth, and that choice changed everything. The applause was generous, but what struck me was the number of younger officers who approached me afterward. Women mostly, but some men too. They thanked me for telling that story. They said they'd experienced similar moments. They said it helped to know they weren't alone. One young woman, maybe 28, said, "My dad still doesn't get what I do. He thinks I'm a secretary with a badge." "Have you explained it?" "So many times, he just doesn't hear it." "Then stop explaining. Just do your job, lead well, be excellent, and let him figure it out on his own timeline. Or not. Either way, you keep moving forward." She nodded, eyes bright. "That's hard." "It is, but it's necessary." She thanked me and walked away. I watched her go and thought about who I was at 28. Hungry for validation, desperate to be seen, uncertain whether I truly belonged. I don't carry that anymore. The uncertainty is gone. The need for approval is gone. What remains is clarity, purpose, the quiet confidence that comes from decades of doing hard work well. I'm not perfect. I still make mistakes. I still doubt decisions. I still struggle with difficult calls. But I don't doubt whether I belong in the rooms I occupy. I don't doubt whether I've earned my position. I don't doubt my authority. And that certainty changes everything. My father will die soon. Not imminently, but inevitably. His health is declining. His world is shrinking. When he goes, I'll mourn him. I'll remember the good parts, his discipline, his work ethic, his insistence on order. I'll remember the hard parts too. The limo incident will be one memory among many, but it won't define us. Not anymore. What will define us is the rebuilding. The slow, imperfect work of two people learning to see each other clearly. It wasn't easy. It wasn't fast. But it was real, and in the end, that's all that mattered. I think about the officers I'm training now, the ones who will take my place when I retire, the ones who will face their own limo moments, situations where their authority is questioned by people who should know better, moments when they have to choose between accommodation and truth. I want them to choose truth. I want them to trust themselves. I want them to stop waiting for permission they don't need because the doors are already unlocked. The clearance is already granted. The authority is already earned. They just have to trust themselves enough to walk through. 15 years ago, I unlocked a limo door and changed the trajectory of my relationship with my father. But more importantly, I changed my relationship with myself. I stopped performing. I stopped accommodating. I stopped shrinking. I became who I'd always been but hadn't fully claimed. And that, in the end, was the real victory. Not the promotion, not the title, not the external recognition, but the internal permission to be exactly who I was, without apology, without hesitation, without doubt. The limo door was always unlocked. I just had to believe I had the right to open it. And once I did, everything else followed.